Welcome back. And we are now transitioning to our first panel discussion. And this discussion will start off with me leading some questions with our two guests. But in this session, we'll also turn to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please drop them into the chat, and we'll weave them into the conversation. Welcome, David. Welcome, Valerie. So excited to have you here. We had wanted to start this conversation off with a very high-level view of global trends. And both of you are in totally unique positions, engaged with stakeholders around the world in your day-to-day work. Valerie, let's start with you. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do at the World Bank.
Thanks, Uwe. Well, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here today. I've known Uwe for a long time in different capacities, so it's always a pleasure to engage in dialogue with you all and learn as well from David. So as Uwe mentioned, I work at the World Bank. I've been at the bank now about 12 years, and I am client-facing, so I specifically focus on managing lending projects around the world related to urban infrastructure and urban development, urban regeneration issues, which touch on placemaking, but that's not necessarily explicit purpose. I also informally coordinate our community of practice at the World Bank related to urban regeneration and land-based financing. And it's basically folks whose projects touch on these topics, and we exchange knowledge and best practices and lessons learned. Prior to joining the bank, of course, I served a term in government here in Washington, D.C., which is how we know each other, under the administration of Adrian Fenty. And that experience serving as deputy mayor for planning and economic development really grounds a lot of my work at the World Bank in the sense that oftentimes we can fly at very high levels with the best intentions and the best data and the analysis. But it's really important, in my experience, to be quite aware of the importance of inclusiveness, of stakeholder buy-in, but also of political economy, and we can talk about that.
That's great. And Valerie, just maybe a little bit more on just the role of cities at the World Bank these days. There's been a major shift in the bank's activities over the years. Just give us a snapshot of how the World Bank engages cities.
Well, I should start by mentioning, we are, of course, a multilateral development bank, and our shareholders are governments of the world. As such, we follow the priorities of our shareholders, which, they ebb and flow at various times, various emphases. At the moment, cities, but particularly climate change, are our top priorities, really climate change and resilience. So the implications for our work, as you know, our mission is really about its development. And we, every 5 years, in all of the countries where we're active, we have country partnership frameworks whereby the country and the World Bank work together to define the priorities. So a country, to pick Jamaica, for example, where development and including of the cities is one of the priorities, there is alignment in other places. To pick an example, I happen to be working currently in Mongolia. The emphases may be around addressing food security issues, which may, not necessarily be about cities. So it's a longer answer to your question, but so much insofar as our governments where we work emphasize cities, that's where we are. We, of course, view our role as well as sharing good practices. So we're always inviting our counterparts to think even beyond where they are. So I'm actually delighted about this conversation and look forward to continuing, because sometimes practices that are really successful in Tirana, Albania, can work super well in another place around the world. People just aren't familiar, so we view ourselves as connectors.
Great. Welcome, David. Really great to have you here at Georgetown. Say a few words about yourself, and I think many of our participants are going to be very interested in learning about the International Downtown Association.
Sure. Well, thank you for having us, of course. And much like Valerie, I've been with IDA for 12 years as well. Prior to that, did some work with the American Institute of Architects and as a chapter, the Michigan chapter of the American Planning Association. So I really come to this work, IDA, as the Professional Place Management Association. Our members are place management organizations that exist largely in the US and Canada, but then we have sister agencies and members around the world. So, for IDA and for the work that we're doing, we are member-based and member-led. So it's very much been about the professionalization of place management. We've created the knowledge domains, the certification programming that is now underway, because it's such an exciting industry, right? So, our members are bridging that gap between the private sector and the public sector to really help, build great communities. So it's pretty fantastic.
So, David, every city has a downtown, but paint a larger picture for us. Who are your members, and how many are there, and how many of these organizations exist?
So, by our estimation, around the world, there's over 4,000, place management organization. There are a multitude of entities doing place making. But if we think about the place management in North America, a little over 2,500 organizations, and they range from very small, one-person staff to very large organizations like downtown Seattle, as an example, that covers the majority of the downtown. So much like we know community is very locally based, the design, the infrastructure, the coordination, the activities of these place management entities varies from place to place. In a city like Seattle, there may be one very large entity with smaller place management organizations in the periphery. But then a place like New York City, they have 76 business improvement districts that are all doing similar work in much smaller geographies. So again, their role is very much around doing activations, doing placemaking. Generally, it's place-based economic development. So if we think about the Sustainable Development Goals of UN, it's very much looking at that economic development opportunity, as well as sustainability, resilience, and things of that nature.
That's great. And share with us a little insight into how IDA works. It's a membership organization. What do members do? What is your function?
Right. So for IDA, we are education, research, and advocacy-based organization. We are looking to build the profession and continue to improve the practices around the world. We're also looking to do more research on the value that place management brings to cities and communities as a whole. And then where we advocate, it's done by our members locally. We're now dipping our toes into how can we support federal investment in cities in a way that really benefits that hyper-local experience.
That's great. So let's start off with, first of all, thank you for that, but let's start off with a kind of a larger frame here. If we look at cities around the world and we think about place management, often related to downtowns, what do both of you see as larger trends? And those might be actual trends in the market, but it might also be trends around what people are thinking, what people are doing. What do you see happening in cities around the world?
I'm going to speak domestically and I can riff internationally.
Sure. So if I'm thinking North America, clearly everyone's still wondering about return to office or the future of work. And I think that's starting to sort itself out pretty well, and we can start to project what may be happening, whether it's a 60%, 70%, 80% return. We like to think more in terms of, well, if we've got a 20% opportunity, how are we best going to use that? And I think a lot of cities are really looking at more of that comprehensive, complete community building. So housing now becomes a number one issue that we're seeing. How can we look at affordability, attainability, missing middle, the full spectrum of housing? Because ultimately that's going to create strong urban communities. And those would probably be the most, primary top two issues that we're looking at domestically.
Interesting. Internationally, particularly in the developing world, people went back to office much sooner than here in the States. So I would say that's definitely less of an issue. Right now, there is still a lot of concern about fiscal constraints in many places, again, given the interest rate environment that we're going through, and of course, as has been in the press, some of the economic challenges in certain regions of the world and political events that are affecting economies, which of course trickle down to cities insofar as, which is how bids came about many years ago, is that cities don't often have enough budget to take care of just public services. And as such, I mean, unfortunately, easy things to get cut are, parks and some of the maintenance. So in terms of, I don't know if it's a trend, but we get at people, the government counterparts, both at land entities and cities where we work, are very interested, increasingly interested, I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years on this topic of how do we leverage government property, so land and buildings, more effectively. So we have a practice at the bank, colleagues who are land experts who work primarily on cadastre and legal and just systemic issues to be able to even understand what do cities own, as much as to how to value them efficiently, because that's a challenge. Other trends have to do with, well, how do we, in addition to how do we unlock value from our existing properties, it's, well, how do we attract private capital? So that's a trend both on terms of multilateral banks like ourselves as well as cities, even more so than I experienced here in the States. So several years ago, the largest multilaterals signed an agreement about increasing how much private capital is leveraged from our investments. And part of the reason why is to free up our, of course, precious assets to be able to use for priorities such as financing climate change, right, which of course crosses borders, and there's simply not enough money in the world currently, even amongst donor entities, to be able to address the issues. So part of our motivation is, again, how does this relate to placemaking in cities, is how can we be strategic. So a good example of that is the Jamaica project, how we use our money, that we're fairly certain we can use it strategically to unlock, whether it's infrastructure, public services that will in turn attract private capital, whether it's by addressing perhaps a resilience-related issue that private capital just simply doesn't have the wherewithal to do, or something that's particularly sticky that requires cross-government cooperation. So.
Very interesting. I think downtowns represent a great point of departure for our conversation on place management, because downtowns are very public places. They're the center not only of individual communities, but of a whole city. And they receive a lot of wear and tear. There are a lot of people coming and going. There are often concerns around safety and wayfinding, and there are also places, as you mentioned, Valerie, where there are a lot of different economic interests. So as a kind of first foray into place-based place management, how have downtowns been the catalyst for this practice to emerge?
Yeah. So I think if we look historically, and this goes back to the 70s, it's really that opportunity to bridge the gap between the public and private sector. Private sector is always looking for some level of assurance or certainty. Government is looking for partnerships with the support of private sector, just as you were talking about, value. I think that's where this profession has really found itself to be extraordinarily strong conveners. Identifying in each locale what the challenge may be, whether it's transportation related, whether it's development of vacant lots. Through the latter part of the century, it was kind of filling in the development of downtowns. Then it became managing the success as we started, seeing more people come back to the city center. So when you had nightlife closing at 2:30, 3 in the morning, and someone is choosing to run at 5:30 in the morning, there's a transition in there that helps to be managed so that all users of the city are feeling safe, secure, and enjoying community. So I think it's at its heart, it's really about that convening factor that can bring all the stakeholders together and all the interests and all the users to understand how are we going to continue to evolve and improve.
And Valerie, it's very interesting to hear you talk about the different kinds of assets that exist in the center of the city. Share with us some of the challenges associated with coordinating those assets. There's some classic challenges, of course, public lands and private lands, different forms of infrastructure that need to be coordinated, different business models associated with the management of infrastructure. How did these things play out in some of your work?
Yes, so I'll give an example from Romania, where Bucharest, the capital, has thousands of properties within the city's portfolio that the national government basically devolved to the city when the government changed. So among the challenges you can probably imagine is figuring out even what they own, and having one database. When I was working there, the teams, they were still digitizing and standardizing the data, certain things that we take for granted in the States. And it's not because people don't know what to do, it's just so complicated and it's expensive. So that's one basic challenge. Another one is, as I mentioned, valuations. So even in places that are quite sophisticated, such as South Africa, Johannesburg and Cape Town, even they don't do annual assessments or even biannual assessments. And in other places, in India and even sophisticated cities, the assessments are maybe tied to what's reported in terms of property transfer, as opposed to market value. And all of these can, of course, affect resources that are available for whether it's placemaking or any other public services. So at least where we are involved, we're often is trying to untangle what has been done before and buttress, whether through technology or trying to perhaps leapfrog good practices to help move on to the next level. And in terms of political economy, I know when I had a project in North Macedonia, common in many places is property tax rates are so low that even when there is fairly good data about who owns what, it's very difficult, of course, for the government to raise rates, and therefore they simply can't afford to invest in the amazing cultural heritage assets that they have there. And so that's part of what our team is doing.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear that it's around valuations and assessments and really available data, because as we're seeing place management, emerge in different countries around the globe, I hadn't thought about the complexities of how different each country or each city may be just on that basic taxation and assessment model. So it's certainly something that we're glad the World Bank's involved with, and something that's going to help really advance civic governance, which continues to evolve.
David, walk us through the basic value proposition associated with an urban district. A downtown district, of course, will have a very clearly delineated line, and of course that line is the genesis not only for the activities associated with a place management organization, but also its finances.
Sure.
And if you could just kind of walk us through the basic rationale for forming an urban district.
Sure. In its simplest form, a public-private partnership. In some instances, it may be more private-public partnership. In other countries and cities, it may be more public-private partnership. But at the essence, it's a group of property owners, business owners, who have come together to say, we have a defined geography. We know that the municipality has a certain capacity to provide services, and we want to layer on top some additional resources. So either through an assessment model, which exists, which does not exist everywhere, or a voluntary membership model. It is these private sector enterprises that are contributing to a not-for-profit management organization. And so that's the management organization who then deploys additional services within that defined geography. The public-private partnership piece comes from gaining some level of authority to operate within the public realm. There's no transfer of ownership per se, but it is much like someone may take out a special event permit. Well, now there's a management entity that's taking out that permit because they're hosting a community gathering in public space. And so that's essentially the value proposition, is above and beyond what the municipality is providing, the property and business owners within a district are looking to level up.
That's great. And Valerie, if you could, there is a tremendous amount of conversation, both in the World Bank, but also in so many other circles with respect to land-based financing. You mentioned this before. And of course, there's a very vibrant conversation around, as cities change, there are opportunities for land value capture. Bring us into that conversation in a little bit, because it seems to me that's quite important.
Yeah.
Because all of those conversations, whether explicit or implicit, are actually place-based.
Definitely. So I think starting from where is it coming from, is that in many places around the world, the trend has been fiscal decentralization, meaning devolution of powers, responsibilities, really, maybe not powers, but responsibilities to cities, which has dovetailed with the trends of urbanization. So cities are being asked to do more, even as more people are coming into cities. And you had asked earlier, what is the value proposition of placemaking, but also of cities? And part of it is co-location of jobs, labor, capital. It's opportunities to have higher quality of life that might be accessible elsewhere. So in this mix, cities are scrambling for other resources. It is, again, in the United States, we take for granted that cities can issue bonds. This is not common in the developing world, and the reason why is because in order here, there's an infrastructure to do so. There's a tax regime that makes it favorable possible. I have worked on several projects in Colombia and South Africa where, again, cities were motivated to find other sources of funding to be able to invest in upgrades to their infrastructure. And because they're dependent on transfers from the national government, which sometimes for political reasons, but often for structural reasons, or simply isn't enough money, are strapped. And so the options are, you can increase your property tax rate, which, if you're a one-term mayor or you're comfortable doing that, or you can get really creative. So creating improvement districts, which have proliferated in South Africa. You can look to do other things that we have tried to help, which is basically localized variations on what we see here. Maybe not bonds precisely, but variations of payment in lieu of taxes bonds. So land-based financing, for us, we get a lot of client requests around it. And as you both well know, it's a spectrum. So we view property taxes on one end of that land-based financing toolkit, which is the most commonly accessible. But we also consider strategic use of government land and buildings as part of that. And improvement districts and placemaking, of course, are intertwined. And then, some of the more sophisticated tools, but also impact fees and whatnot. So I definitely think they're intertwined. I view improvement districts as the next up on the food chain in terms of beyond property taxes, more accessible to many of our cities that would love to be able to become creditworthy, but due to structural reasons, it's simply not possible in the current regulatory environment. I will mention a clarification again in terminology between domestic and international. So improvement districts, among the challenges to do more of them, even though there's been a lot of interest, is the regulatory framework. So you need to be able to have the power to collect the money and put it in a escrow account. Right. And in some places, for political and other reasons, that's simply not possible. And so, in fact, as you may be aware, the dynamic has changed in South Africa, whereby Cape Town's improvement districts continue, but in Johannesburg and Greater Gauteng province, they've been eliminated and they're trying to retool.
Right.
So regulatory issues, I think, are something that can be addressed, but often that's one of the threshold issues preventing moving forward. And as such, we see tremendous energy from nonprofits, which is fantastic. So arts-based group, arts groups, cultural heritage, and they may be driving the discussion as much as private landowners who have economic interest. Often it's from a sense of, we want to reclaim the space and let's bring our energy, and that also has been a factor that you see in the States, but even more so than I've seen domestically.
And it's fascinating because that mechanism for creating the improvement district and financing the improvement district. I remember in El Salvador when they were creating an improvement district, the vehicle ended up being an attachment to the water bill because that was the vehicle that they had, because it wasn't going to be through property tax.
Yeah.
David, in your organization, the genesis is really focused on traditional downtowns, but there are so many different kinds of practitioners in your network. Can you share with us some of the diversity of governance types and the different kinds of people that are interested in place management? And I'm just thinking about this very interesting and important comment Valerie just made around the importance of culture. And culture almost driving, not just an individual place-making event, but really a heightened level of management of different public spaces and cities.
So in North America, I'll say, it's the reason International Downtown Association is simply IDA, because not everyone is a downtown. We're seeing place management occur, certainly in traditional central business districts or city centers, but then it's also in commercial neighborhoods in general, and moving out into suburban environments. Some might think in terms of that enclosed mall that's now becoming broken apart, and looking at issues of transportation in a more retrofit, walkable suburban environment. Place management entities exist there. So, very much consistent with the practice of place-based activations, the culture of a place, the authenticity of a place. Our member organizations are partnering with arts groups, with cultural groups, with a multitude of nonprofits. It's really, I think, public, private, and not-for-profit foundations and civic infrastructure that come together and say, how are we going to make this place special? It's really where we're seeing that 15-minute city concept really emerge more and more, whether it's the 15-minute neighborhood that's part of a major metro, or whether it's a small, mid-sized city that in and of itself, we were just learning of Ipswich, and really targeting how they're taking their place-based management function to be a connected city at that town scale. So yeah, it's not only about downtown at all. It's really any place going from high dense major metro to small town. In North America, you may think of a Main Street environment, which is very small.
Yeah, that's a perfect opportunity to segue to some of the questions that are rolling in, and I welcome everyone to submit additional questions via the chat. And we'll start off with this excellent first question, and that is that in recent years, of course, recent decades, we're all part of this enormous digital revolution that is occurring in cities. And this question has to do with your perspectives on the broad term of smart cities, but more specifically, the new kinds of data sources that place management organizations and specific places within cities have access to, and the broader trends associated with the Internet of Things and the ability to manage the built environment in a way that was really unthinkable even a decade or two ago.
Maybe I can weigh in from a place management perspective. Probably the most impactful in recent, I wouldn't say months and years, has been anonymized cell phone data.
Yes.
And there's a multitude of platforms that are leveraging that to better understand how users are experiencing our urban places. Place management organizations historically, because they know their district so well, always know those parts of the district that need a little additional support. And so that's where they would do activations. That's where they would try and improve the areas, even within their small geography. But with the anonymized data, now it's a whole host of understanding, what's the pathways that people are taking, where are they coming from, how long are their dwell times, what can we learn about that user's experience that we can then leverage and enhance so that it's really benefiting everyone. So, when we talk about, technology, I think that's by far the most impactful recently.
Really interesting.
Interesting. Hearing that example reminds me of a project a few years ago that I worked on. It was, we were working in Tbilisi, Georgia, this is before the war, where we were, had hired a firm to look at anonymized data to get feedback on views on parks and public space. And we were trying to support the municipality about making decisions where to invest in public space and what kind of public space, trails versus playgrounds, where to put it. And that was, I learned a tremendous amount because this was, for me, cutting edge, probably 5 years ago. I would say that availability of data differs tremendously from, of course, a place like Tokyo, of course, in North America versus many of the places in which I work. So while access to information and examples is very widespread, the availability of data, even about real estate and values, is still challenging, and which can affect government decision making. So again, for us, we try and support through making some of the technology available, and particularly mapping software. So again, the example of whether it's parks or mapping the location of housing units and planned units versus, some of it to you both is probably old hat, but some of these again are helping to make investment decisions, particularly in a tightening fiscal environment, that are most strategic.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was just going to say that it's interesting, this whole issue of data that, has so many critical questions associated with it around stewardship and privacy, of course. But one of the primary functions of place management organizations is actually to understand the data that is even available and understand the contours of what is not available. What an important function that is within cities that local government cannot often deliver on its own. Do you have thoughts on that, of how these organizations aggregate data?
So having robust kind of research components to place management organizations has been, I think, the hallmark for the last 15, 20 years of growing that capability, because even in kind of our aggregate metro data, or in the US where it's census blocks, that still isn't quite small enough. And so when we think about some of the major trends that we read in the media about, it's at a data level that does not represent the unique nature of any one city or any one downtown center city area. And so if we're making decisions based on a very high level data, I think we'll more often get it wrong. So place management organizations, again, only focusing on really core geography or sub areas, have really found that they can get real precise and share that then with decision makers, share that with civic leaders, share that with stakeholders to really understand, from a pure data-driven decision basis, here's the options, here's the opportunity. I was reminded when you were talking about, engaging an understanding of how best to use parks in Georgia. We just, Camden Town, the management district, in a very low-tech way, opened up its prioritization of public park development and transportation into kind of participatory budgeting process through very simple technology. So again, data both receiving and analyzing, but also opening it up for the users to participate. Was really a fantastic example of your earlier question around kind of the Internet of everything.
I would say that another point about data is what kind of data. So there's a nonprofit that I've gotten to know in Kingston called Kingston Creative. You probably have met them as well. Very dynamic, arts-based advocacy organization. And they're bringing a lot of energy and attention to that area. And part of, I think, the value of organizations like them is also being able to track who is coming to a place and helping get a handle on how much they're spending and where they're coming from. Because that isn't necessarily, again, except in more sophisticated cities that have the resources to do so, something that it's easily available. And it's important in many places to make the case. So again, we take it for granted in many of our cities in North America, and of course sophisticated cities like Mexico City, about the the economic value and the social value, of course, of public spaces, but sometimes smaller micro businesses and small businesses need to be convinced about how do you upgrade your product mix to be able to earn more money, and it really helps to be able to make the case with numbers, not just here's some pictures about what's coming.
It's so fascinating. You know, the whole process of economic development within cities it can never be solved just at a kind of like 30,000 foot level. It is so place-based. It's block by block, it's business by business, how are businesses working together, and there's all kinds of information and data associated with supporting those activities. Let's pivot. We have another excellent question that has come in, and the question is really around how war has disrupted cities and how place-based responses have emerged as a result of war. But what I would like to do is actually broaden that a little bit and think about very disruptive events within cities, or cities that have gone through very significant political shifts. We can think of Berlin, right? Or we can think of Belfast, or we even think of cities in metropolitan areas like San Diego and Tijuana. You know, there are kind of political frames there that have shifted, or that are really impacting the way in which people experience the cities. Is this something that's come up in your work?
For sure. I was going to say,
yes.
but it also exists. I agree with you. This is applicable even domestically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, internationally, there's many different ways to answer the question. I mean, to state the obvious, the destruction of infrastructure and public spaces, such as happening right now in various places in the world, I mean, the impact is resources have to be diverted to address those immediate needs, and the arguable nice-to-haves, again, arts and culture, may unfortunately not get fed in the meantime as resources need to get diverted. So what does that mean? Human beings, we need each other. We are social creatures. So people, no matter what's going on, whether it's a natural disaster, war, people will still find ways to gather. I think it's just more of a breakdown and maybe perhaps of the physical institutions, but the human institutions persist. And as your question earlier about technology, that's one of the things that actually is quite clear, is that, you know, despite the destruction, again, in many places, that the communities continue to exist, and connectedness across virtual forms. I mean, I can talk about what the bank is doing about these things, but I think maybe I'd be curious to hear your take on domestic, how this affects the domestic sphere here in the States.
Well, I appreciate just the thought around community, because regardless the disruption, man-made or natural, it's almost the silver linings when we do see community come back together to resolve itself after any sort of disruption. And we can think about the most recent, you know, the pandemic itself. You know, I think if we look at that hyper-local improvement district example, organizations in the improvement district world had the very best connections with their local businesses, resident populations, things of that nature. So when government needed to work at a high level to resolve and invest, often it was deployed through these smaller, locally based, you know, place-based organizations. Private sector came to the table with additional resources. Many of our members had additional grant programs they were administering with private investment and foundational investment, because they knew how to deploy those resources at that really local level.
Right.
So regardless of the disruption, I think it still is a question of there's federal level activity that needs to take place. There's more of that state, provincial, precinct level, but then there's always going to be that kind of neighborhood improvement district level, where it's just another part of that civic infrastructure that can respond to either man-made or natural war, or extreme floods. I can recall, was it Sandy storm? You know, Lower Manhattan was flooded and had no ability to transact any business for a long period of time. But back in the day, all of a sudden, Square was a way in which local merchants could could still operate their businesses, even if they were a small little, food purveyor. That was something that downtown organizations actually provided, was that square technology to all their merchants that needed to just get up and running using mobile technology rather than their traditional POS.
So we can imagine, of course, and there are many examples of disasters or armed conflicts playing out in cities today. But let's pivot a little bit and think about longer-term systemic issues in cities. In particular, and certainly in the case of the United States, longer-term frameworks of exclusion, of segregation, and how does that play into your work today? Some of these are incredibly local, expressed through city regulations, histories of segregation and zoning, but they play themselves out in the fabric of communities across all cities in the United States, and indeed internationally as well. So how, moved on from kind of the acute challenge of a disaster, how does the work of place management organizations, and what do you see happening in place management organizations associated with social inclusion?
Well, I can speak for my members across the U.S. and in Canada in particular. I'm proud of the fact they've all leaned in very hard over the last several years in particular to understand what is their role in looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is hundreds of years in the making, and so understanding how to look at those systems and what role place management can play really is multi-layered. So it's what can the management district do in its own physical services and provision of programming, but then it's also themselves as an organization and how they're addressing even their own workforce. Their boards of directors, often represent commercial real estate or the business community, and so there's a little different, perhaps lighter touch in trying to how can we influence that. Commercial real estate in this country is a long tenured system of circumstance. So they're operating at all levels to understand how can we make the most complete communities is what we're looking for. So in particular, currently, it's really addressing the affordability of housing as a crisis, and serving the unhoused on a daily basis is something that place management organizations do virtually every day.
I would say here in DC, I think the 11th Street Bridge Project has done a fantastic job, the team there, of addressing these concerns about inclusiveness. Partially they're helped because they're able to include the perspectives on design and activities, and they've done a great job, I think, of bringing the communities along. Unfortunately, I think that's more of an exception. Hopefully that's a trend in the future. Yeah. And it's natural that, for me, I think one of the tensions about improvement districts in general is, of course, the largest landowners will want the largest voice. If they're funding a significant portion, and it's a natural tension. And I've seen it in various places where there's not an explicit improvement district, but there's talk about it. The micro and small businesses, the vendors in the public markets, we're going to get left out. You guys just want, not you guys as in the bank, but this project will kick us out. And it is definitely a tension. And I think that the IDA and other organizations have done much to try and illuminate can be a win-win situation. It's not just people scrabbling over a small pie, but let's work together through data and research and et cetera, et cetera. But that's been the fear. Mm-hmm. So speaking of culture, it's true also well in DC for good reason. Some communities feel like they were not included in decisions, or they were included but their voice wasn't heard sufficiently, and as such their businesses suffered. I know even in my experience here in Washington, when I was in DC government, we took a lot of flack about some of the decisions we made about creating a dog park, for example, in a particular neighborhood that, best of intentions, thought this was something, had heard feedback, and then other neighbors saying, wait a minute, I really want something else. And so I think, these are, to your point, micro decisions. And I think there's actually greater opportunity in larger downtown areas where there's an improvement district, because you can serve multiple communities if you have a larger space, whether that's through the types of activities you host or the design there. It's much harder when it's smaller, and the understandably the largest landowners would want a larger voice.
That's great.
And I would say, I think it's also recognizing it's evolving, and it continues to evolve. And yes, when we were first doing this work, and it was a business improvement district, that was the 1970s, early stages. Now it's really more about community improvement districts, because we have residential population in our mixed-use downtown environments, and so that representation, that voice is changing, and has been over the last several decades.
So thanks to both of you again. To close out, we have one last question, and it's really, from my perspective, a beautiful question, and that has to do with the uniqueness of cities. And I think both of you are in a really have a special vantage point, dealing with networks that truly are global, dealing with multiple cities at once, seeing larger trends that are occurring. Do you see this issue of place management as somehow kind of homogenizing cities in some way through a set of global practices? Or are these place management organizations actually the vehicle to keep cities unique, express, the unique voices of local culture? And if it's the latter, how might those different trends and strategies differ from region to region around the world? Big question.
I think I would say that yes, there is a danger of homogenization, but I wouldn't say that's the fault of the placemaking entities. I would say that's partially the globalization of capital and of the real estate industry, insofar as not to pick on the Qataris, but a Qatari investor, or again, fill in the blank for a global investor, may want a name brand Pritzker team to design their latest waterfront mixed-use project. And so, not on purpose, but I think that understandably there is a certain practices are moved around the world, and there is a risk of homogenization as space gets designed. I get to see proposals from whether it's design firms or development firms in various places, and it's rare that you see something that's truly different. There's just so much the same. That said, I do think that training locally based folks in some of the practices, again, exchanging knowledge across regions, not just North America out, but amongst, whether it's Jamaica, Mongolia, Albania, to somewhere, a city in Brazil. I think that really helps a lot in terms of sharing quite unique practices, because some of the challenges in those cities, the balancing, for example, between the tensions of a growing capital city and a small country, just simply don't exist in the same way here. And I agree with you totally, Uwe, about the importance of making sure it's a unique local environment. So I remember a few years ago I was working on a project in St. Lucia where we were investing in tourism-related infrastructure and transport infrastructure, and we were trying to figure out if we could support the redevelopment of the downtown area. And it was challenging to figure out how do you localize it in a design that is true and authentic and bring in those elements and yet serve the economic needs of, in this case, the Port Authority and cruise ships and whatnot, and balancing amongst those different factors and not pushing out the micro businesses that sell their products, which are amazing, but packaged in cellophane and not labeled, and anyway.
Absolutely, homogenization is a threat, but I'm excited when I see best practice, which tends to be more uniform in its principle. But then when you have local-based entities that are deploying that, we joke about R&D as rip off and duplicate. but it's not duplicate in an exact way. It's how do you make it authentic to the context of that locale. And so yeah, I do think that the more engaged you are with the local place-based entity, the more you're going to take some universally successful principles and give them more of an authentic implementation at the local level. And that's where we get, really that wonderful experience of being able to visit and live and work in a variety of cities, either within the same country or across the world, and have some principles that are successful, but the experience is very unique. And I'm hopeful that as place management continues to evolve, that idea of rip off and duplicate doesn't mean an explicit duplication, but it's really saying, now how do I apply this principle in a way that is meaningful and authentic and inclusive of our culture?
Yeah, and just maybe a little footnote to this, one of the roundtables that we'll be organizing this fall is with a cultural markets association in Doha, which is very, very interesting. And these are kind of emerging place-based informal markets that have been seen by stakeholders as being totally unique to the communities and places that they're taking place in. So really looking forward to that. David, Valerie, thank you so much for helping us kick off this conversation.
Thank you.
We really look forward to ongoing collaboration, and we'll be in touch over the fall and circle back in December when we've completed all of the conversations. Thank you for welcoming us into your practices and your networks and understanding how place management is, in fact, an important thing happening in cities around the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Uwe.
Thanks, Uwe.
We're going to take a short 5-minute break, and we'll come back and reconvene with Professor Rich Bradley.